From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, coming to you once again from Mumbai, India. If that means anything to anybody, it does to me because I'm here. My co-host is David Feldman, New York City, and man of the hour, back in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., is Ralph Nader. We have an excellent show for you today. Having passed tax day, we're going to talk about Ralph's column in the IRS and also his recent post about bankruptcy law shielding GM from liability in ignition switch cases, plus your Facebook questions. But first, David, tell us about our guest today.
Our guest today is Steve Shafarman. He is Program Director of Basic Income Action, a new nonprofit organization working to promote social, political, and economic justice by ensuring that every citizen has an income for food and shelter at least. Stephen has been writing about guaranteed income since the mid-1980s. He's a life member of the Basic Income Earth Network, and he's presented papers at their meetings in Geneva back in 2002, Dublin in 2008, and in Montreal last year. He is currently completing a book entitled On Pursuing Happiness, Basic Income. Welcome to the show, Steve Shafarman.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for being on the show, Steve. I came across your book very recently, as I told you on the telephone, that it came out about 13 years ago. And it made the case for basic income, which today is viewed as like pie in the sky. And of course, you started it saying this has long roots. For example, Richard Nixon, Milton Friedman, they were in favor of some sort of minimum incomes plan, which is simpler. It got rid of a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of back and forth with people and their government handing out certain services and support structures. So before the listeners think we're talking about utopia, we're actually talking about a combination of fairness, justice, and efficiency affecting everybody in the country. So why don't you give us an idea of your first book? What kind of reaction was there to a book that had such great pragmatic horizons for everybody in our country and was based on, in effect, a platform on abolishing poverty?
Well, I've been exploring these ideas for a long time, as you've already mentioned. And exciting and frustrating thing for me is that it's an idea that seems to make so much sense. And as you mentioned, Richard Nixon, Milton Friedman, many people. In fact, this was a mainstream moderate idea in the 1960s and goes back much earlier than that to Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Thomas Paine. As far as my books, they've been with small publishers or self-published, and I've moved to Washington, D.C., and have met with lots of people in think tanks and activists from across the political spectrum. And basically the response has been, oh, this is very nice, but. And then they launch into all the reasons why it's no longer possible to talk about anything so big and bold. So what I've continued to do is look for new ways to present this idea to make it really clear and accessible to ordinary Americans.
Well, as you know, and you've written in your first book, Daniel P. Moynihan became an assistant to Nixon in the White House, and he sold him on this.
Yes.
And Milton Friedman was big on this. And what is this? It's basically a basic income for all Americans, regardless of who they are, what background. And it replaces a lot of programs that are not very efficient, and sometimes they're applied in a cruel way. Mm-hmm. And you happen to live in a country that doesn't like solutions, maybe technical solutions to their iPhone, but by and large, I've had the same experience. Whenever you propose something that is evidential, that is plainly worked in other countries, for example, I mean, starting with seatbelts, you know, they use it in Sweden, you know, is there a different anatomy here? Why don't you use it here? Anything that makes our country better, it seems to be viewed either as idealistic at best, bizarre at worst, or it challenges the power structure. So it's degraded on that ground alone. And yet, our country's best foot forward over the years has been the blasphemy of today becomes the commonplace of tomorrow. And for example, people used to assume that they could go on an airplane, they had to imbibe people's smoke because people smoked cigarettes on airplanes. Now, if they went on an airplane and somebody was smoking, they'd hit the roof, right? So what was blasphemy, what? You're going to keep smokers from smoking on airlines? Has become a commonplace acceptance. And that's what I want to see a lot of what you're doing become. But you see, this is an amazing thing, and I have to digress here. We have all kinds of publishers for people who have inspirational stories of overcoming addictions, or sports inspirational stories, or Hollywood inspirational stories, or thousands of books on inspirational stories for entrepreneurs, right?
Absolutely.
And yet, when you have an inspirational story or an inspirational program for civic justice for everybody, I mean, really serious stuff, not some, trivial tale, the publishers aren't interested. I was just talking with a publisher this morning. I said, how come you don't publish heroic civic achievements? I mean, we have Lois Gibbs in the whole toxic prevention area. She has hundreds and hundreds of little groups all over the country. If someone went to a publisher and said, I want to publish the story of Lois Gibbs, they said, well, I don't know if we have a market for this, or it doesn't fit. This is a very serious problem to getting your story across. Give me a reaction.
I have been dealing with this problem for a long time, and I'm dealing with it right now with looking for a publisher for my new book. We have been so brainwashed by the status quo, and it's as if consent and conventional thinking are the rule, and anything that deviates is impermissible. That the people who present truly new ideas like basic income are just unacceptable, mad, bad, and dangerous to know, as one of my friends likes to say.
Okay, so let's get down to the basic income idea, which may be vague to people because we've had a whole generation when it's never discussed in elections or by candidates or hearings in Congress. Why don't you describe in detail what it is, who gets it, who pays for it, what does it replace?
Well, as you've already suggested very nicely, it's the ultimate in simplicity, and that's what makes it so powerful. What we're saying is that let's choose some amount. Maybe it's $800 a month or $1,000 or $1,200 to be determined. Choose some amount and give that unconditionally to every adult citizen. So the homeless veterans in the street will get it. Students, full-time parents, Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey will get it.
No means test.
No means test, unconditional. And because you do it that way, with no means testing, it requires minimal government bureaucracy. It reduces almost entirely the opportunities for fraud or game playing. And you ask what we could get rid of. Well, if everyone has $1,000 a month, the current federal official poverty line for a family of four is approximately $24,000. So immediately, a married couple or just two people living together are at the poverty level. We could eliminate a whole range of social programs that are bureaucratic and inefficient. At the same time, it totally eliminates the rationale for corporate welfare. And what we hear constantly in political discourse from Democrats and Republicans, even the most esteemed liberals, is that government has to create jobs. And everyone's talking about doing this to create jobs and that to create jobs. And we live here in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that I find continually frustrating and also amusing is that on the buses and on the metro, we see big posters for the defense contractors saying, we're creating 100,000 jobs building the F-35. And from other big corporations saying, we're creating jobs drilling oil wells and such. Well, I've looked really closely, and nowhere in the Constitution or the Declaration or any of the founding documents did they talk about jobs. And nowhere did they talk about corporations or corporate welfare. So when everyone has a basic income, people will be able to manage their basic needs on their own initiative. It's a poverty level, so people will still have huge incentives to want to work and earn and go to school and improve the quality of life for themselves and their families. And thus it's an idea that ought to appeal to liberals and conservatives to
Get rid of crony capitalism, which the right wing calls crony capitalism,
Absolutely.
and progressives call corporate welfare. Subsidies, handouts, giveaways, bailouts.
Yeah,
half of what Washington does.
half of what Washington does. And the real power of this idea is that it eliminates the rationale for it. So instead of fighting over this little program or that big program, instead of name calling about crony capitalism, let's just say every citizen as a right will have an income for food and shelter.
Well, listeners right now are probably saying, okay, Stephen, how much is this going to cost? And who is going to pay for it? And before you do that, I remember in Canada, they still send a check to every family for the children, don't they? A monthly check, or is it now phased out?
I think it's been phased out.
But for decades.
Yes, for decades they did, and many European countries do send checks for
Okay,
children.
so how much is this going to cost, and how are you going to pay for it?
Well, the economists I work with have run the numbers in various combinations, and it essentially would pay for itself once we begin to really cut the programs that become superfluous. So that shouldn't be an issue. Of course, here in Washington, that's always the excuse that we can't do this because it would cost $1 trillion or $2 trillion. But once you begin looking at the possibilities for simplifying the tax code and for eliminating corporate welfare and eliminating massive bureaucracies, it would easily pay for itself. And when I present this idea, one of the reasons I deliberately finesse some of the numbers is say, well, if we can't pay for it at $1,000 a month, then maybe we should start with just $500 or $600 a month, which we could certainly pay for.
Of course, there'd be fewer people on Medicaid, housing assistance, energy subsidies, and food stamps, right?
Right, absolutely. And it's not just the savings at the federal level. And if this is a national program, it would also eliminate a lot of assistance of one
State
sort
and
or
local.
another, state and local.
Okay, so you're going to put a lot of people out of work because the bureaucracy of corporate welfare and the bureaucracy of the social welfare activities employ a lot of people.
That's true.
So how do you deal with all the unemployed people once people are getting cash straight out instead of filling out pages of Medicaid forms and all the rest?
I talk to some of those people because I live in Washington, D.C., and there are many who work here. And most of them are not particularly happy with those jobs. I know a great number of people who would like to be full-time parents, who would like to be writers or poets or spend more time developing their own businesses or working on inventions. So what I'm offering people is the freedom to pursue meaningful work and to pursue their dreams. And so those people who lose the current jobs will by and large find something more meaningful and more satisfying.
What would happen to Social Security and private pensions?
Well, Social Security is an existing program, and that money has been taken out of our paychecks. So I think we need to defer that question until after we have the basic income.
What do you mean by defer?
Once every adult has a basic income,
Right.
then I think we'll be able to have a real calm and sensible conversation about how to reform Social Security and whether to integrate it with the basic income, whether to convert it to private pensions of some sort. But initially, the basic income would be added to Social Security. It would be on top of
people
Social Security.
still be able to keep their private pensions?
Of course, this is totally unrelated to private pensions.
Okay. So if Social Security's needs are down because people have a basic income, does that mean there are fewer dollars withheld from their paychecks?
Well, again, these are questions that we'll have to explore in some detail as we phase in the actual program and in the first years after it's operating.
And how does your program mesh with the proposal by a lot of progressives, which actually has majority support, full Medicare for all, everybody in, nobody out, free choice of doctor and hospital?
That's another issue that I deliberately defer until after we have the basic income, because I think the most fundamental fact of all is that right now there are a great many people who are barely getting by. And
Yeah, like,
in theory, we have the unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as everyone knows, life requires at least an income for food and shelter.
And how many poor people you think there are, including children? How do you define it? How many millions in the U.S.?
Well, those are good questions, and I have to confess that I prefer to focus on the theoretical aspect because we can argue over numbers and details forever, and here in Washington, that's what a lot of people in the think tanks and in the government love to do. And what we need first, in my experience, is to have a real conversation about the fundamental principles, the kind of conversation that the founders were having back in the 1770s and 1780s.
But wouldn't it make your argument stronger if you can say it'll eliminate poverty for 50 million Americans or 70 million? Or
if we have the basic income and it's $1,000 a month for every adult,
Right.
It will eliminate extreme poverty, period,
Period.
for everyone who is living with extreme poverty of any sort.
Now, one thing you do in the proposed book, and I hope there'll be a publisher for it soon, this is one you call Pursuing Happiness, Basic Income for Peace, Justice, Liberty, and Personal Dignity. I like the way you started out, a very personal introduction. And it starts out, quote, "The first person in this book is you. Your dreams and goals are core concerns, what you want for yourself, your family, your community, and our country, and what you want from our government and for it as a citizen. These ideas are more important than the author." Oh, that's nice. "Please pretend we're friends, though. Imagine you're excited to see me, and we haven't been in touch since high school, when we were close, and I'm eager to hear about you and your life. The best way for us to reconnect, I suggest for you to read this book. It's short and sincere, and I've worked hard to make it pleasant reading. You might also pretend it was inspired by dreams, goals, hopes, doubts, fears, and concerns we've all shared, and I wrote it to help us reconnect." What you're really trying to do, Steve, is raise people's expectation levels before you get into,
Yes.
into the details.
Yes, that's exactly right. And this is the point that I see in almost all of the political discourse. And when I talk to people in the think tanks and people on Capitol Hill and in government, is everyone is talking in very abstract terms. They're talking about poverty, they're talking about income inequality, they're talking about statistics. And for me, the fundamental question is, what is democracy? And what does it mean to be a citizen? And I think real democracy is when citizens are talking to their friends and families, talking over the dinner table or over a beer at the local club or a Coke or coffee, and discussing what do we want from our government? What is important to us? And so we, the people, should then be telling our representatives what to do for us, instead of what we have now, which is a kind of inverted, twisted democracy where the special interests choose candidates and sell the candidates to us and sell the policies to us as if they're selling soap or toilet paper.
So your idea is to have enough voters to fill an auditorium with 300 people and summon their congressional representatives back to their districts, see where the direction is. They
Oh, yes.
summon their elected representatives to discuss fundamental issues that you're putting out in this book. Remember John Maynard Keynes, in the middle of the Depression in the 1930s, wrote this famous paragraph which said, "Modern economies now have reached a level of production where it won't be long before we will be able to abolish the economic problem." That was his phrase,
Right.
the economic problem, which is another phrase for poverty. The point, I think, that supports what you're saying in terms of expectation level, so people don't think it's pie in the sky, is that the GDP is 20 times greater than it was in 1900 per capita, adjusted for inflation. Why do we have any poverty? Obviously, the economy is screwed up in a number of ways, not only the haves and the have-nots, but more and more economic activity, overloading the armaments, for example, corporate welfare, is not meeting the necessities of everyday people. It's going out into wild, crazy territory that makes some people rich, or into trivial territory. I mean, look at the money spent on whimsy, right? And you have 18 million children who go to sleep hungry at night. So
yeah, and as a lot of listeners probably recall, back in the 60s, social scientists were hugely concerned about this pending problem that there was going to be too much leisure time. And the news magazines and the academic journals were all discussing what was going to happen when robots and computers came in and there was too much leisure time. And that was when the idea of a basic income first took widespread hold in this country, from Milton Friedman and many conservatives on the one side, and from John Kenneth Galbraith and James Tobin and George McGovern on the liberal side. And as you mentioned, Daniel Patrick Moynihan was domestic policy advisor to Richard Nixon. They introduced the Family Assistance Plan, which was a guaranteed income for poor families. It passed in the House with 2/3 of the vote.
And then the Senate?
And then in the Senate Finance Committee, it was narrowly defeated because the extreme conservatives, who didn't want to do anything to help the poor, added conditions and got the extreme liberals to vote against it, because the extreme liberals were looking for a campaign issue for 1972.
The Senate, the graveyard of democracy.
And in the Finance Committee, so it never even got a vote on the floor. And that's how the Senate is often operating, as a graveyard of democracy.
And no other president since sent it to Congress.
I was told, actually, that Gerald Ford, if he had been elected in 1976, would have reintroduced it. I knew
Clinton
someone who was
didn't
one
do
of... Clinton didn't do anything like it, wouldn't talk about anything like it. Jimmy Carter did present a program for jobs and income support in 78, I believe. But at that point, the Congress was so hostile to Carter that it never got anywhere. And again, I moved to Washington, D.C., having self-published my first book about these ideas and made the rounds of think tanks trying to get some support. And basically, people told me, well, this is an idea whose time has come and gone, and we can't talk about it anymore. So I and a number of friends in the Basic Income Network have persisted in trying to talk about this idea and trying to generate a national conversation, while the need for this idea has become every day more apparent.
So in other words, what was interesting to Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Milton Friedman, Martin Luther King Jr. is not sufficiently interesting to the think tanks, to the politicians today.
And the Martin Luther King Jr. case is one that I find particularly discouraging, because in his last book, he strongly endorsed the idea of the guaranteed income, discussed it in some detail. He discussed it in speeches during that last year. And every year, Martin Luther King Day comes around, and we hear replays of the I Have a Dream speech, and nobody talks about his support for guaranteed income.
You mentioned the Alaska Fund. Why don't you describe that briefly?
It's one of the great ideas in the United States that most people don't know about. In Alaska, every resident receives a yearly check from oil royalties. And oil in Alaska was discovered in the late 70s. It's in the Alaska Constitution that the national resources belong to the people. And so when they began developing oil there, they created the Alaska Permanent Fund and then the Permanent Fund Dividend. And since 1982, every Alaskan over the age of 6 months gets a yearly check.
And what's the range? How much do they get?
When it was first started, it was $1,000. It fluctuates year by year because it's a permanent fund, meaning that the money is initially invested in a wide range of securities. One year, it actually was $3,200.
Every man, woman, and child.
Everyone over the age of 6 months. Every man, woman, and child. And the year that it was $3,200, it's normally about $1,000 to $1,200, $1,900. You can easily look that up online. The year it was $3,200 was the first year of Sarah Palin as governor. And the reason it was so high is that when she was running for office, she pushed for a surcharge on the oil revenues. And so she pushed through this bonus on the permanent fund, and it's the reason she was so popular during her first year in office. Of course, when she ran for vice president and since, not one word about the permanent fund. And so I encourage every journalist who interviews Sarah Palin to press her on this. Would she support something like the Alaska Permanent Fund for all Americans?
They wouldn't even ask the question, probably, huh?
Yeah, well, it will be interesting to see.
How popular is it? Have there been attempts to repeal it by the oil industry? Or?
There was an attempt a few years ago, and it was overwhelmingly defeated.
Both right and left like it.
Oh, yes, everyone loves
And
it.
there's a very conservative politics in
Yes, in Alaska, everyone loves it. It was, in fact, originally introduced by a Republican governor, Jay Hammond.
So in other words, the two senators from Alaska and the representative, Don Young, who wouldn't vote for added food to hungry kids, would defend the Alaska Permanent Fund because it's political suicide to attack it, right?
Absolutely, it would be political suicide for any elected official in Alaska.
Because
to
it has
attack.
left-right support.
Right.
Where are the libertarians on this? They like to think about new ideas. Are they appalled by your idea? Government
No.
writing checks?
Actually, one of the exciting things about this idea is that it appeals to people from across the political spectrum as long as they have the courage to look at new ideas. And there are many libertarians who love this idea as a way to radically cut welfare and corporate welfare and excess defense spending and other programs.
Even though it requires taxation?
Even though it requires taxation. In fact, one very prominent libertarian, Charles Murray, wrote a book calling for a version of this idea.
Where is Reason Magazine and those guys?
I have talked to them a little bit and haven't been able to get a firm response.
How
from
about
them.
Ron Paul and Rand Paul?
I talked to Ron Paul about it a few times when he was still in Congress and never got any
Not willing
response.
to go that far, huh?
Well, and that's why in the new book,
Yeah.
Pursuing Happiness, I'm really writing the book for ordinary Americans and saying that we, the people, as individuals, as citizens, have to reclaim our democracy, and here's an idea that can help us do that, because members of Congress and the people in the DC think tanks aren't going to do it for us.
You know, it is very simply written, listeners. He goes through it step by step. He has the history of it. It goes back to the Bible.
The Bible is one of the only books around that really says positive things about poverty and really says that
Many
poor
times.
people, many times.
Many times.
And when I listen to a lot of so-called conservative Christians denounce this idea, I often wonder, what Bible are they reading?
The Old Testament, maybe.
Yeah, but even in the Old Testament, we had the idea of Jubilee, and the resources had to be returned to people.
Jubilee is cancellation of debts.
Yeah, cancellation of debts.
Which there's a movement to
and
cancel
redistribution
the
of
debt.
resources.
Yeah. Well, it's generally known that other countries are ahead of us. And so you have a section on international comparisons. You want to give a couple examples?
Well, what's fascinating about this is that it was an American idea, and Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, one of the great books about it, which listeners can find online, is Agrarian Justice by Thomas Paine. And in 1797, he said that the land is the common property of mankind, and that everyone who appropriates land, puts up a fence, should pay a ground rent to the community, and that money should be distributed. So this idea has this long history here, and in the 1960s, it almost became law. This idea helped spark the progressive movement in the 1880s and 90s, helped us win Social Security in 1935. But since the 1960s, when it was defeated, a lot of Europeans have been taking this on. There's a group called the Basic Income European Network, was founded in 1986. And in 2002, they changed their name to the Basic Income Earth Network, because this idea is now getting a lot of attention in most of the European countries. In Finland, many elected officials have endorsed it. There are specific political parties in Belgium and other countries who make this an issue. In Italy, the Five Star Movement.
And they already have a big safety net compared to the U.S.
That's exactly right. They have a real safety net, but what they've seen in the last decade or more is corporations and governments promoting austerity and chipping away at their safety net.
True.
So what the activists there from the left and the right have been saying is, let's have this basic income as a right so that they can't take it away from us.
We've been speaking with Stephen Shafarman. Steve, why don't you give the contact numbers where people can reach you? And then we're going to have Steve Scrovan and David Feldman ask questions if they'd like.
Well, we're just launching the Basic Income Action, because what's been clear to a lot of us is that in order to move these ideas forward, we need a real nonprofit that can focus specifically on this idea and that can network with the other nonprofits and the activist groups and promote it. So We're just putting up the new website at basicincomeaction.org.
Basicincomeaction.org.
Yes. And we'll have the first part of that website up within the next few days. So by the time people listen to this interview,
Do you want to give your email?
people can email me directly at sshaffarman@gmail.org. So that's SSHAFARMAN @gmail.com.
This kind of disinterest even goes to magazines, progressive magazines. They don't even want you to write an article on this.
I and many other people have been writing articles and submitting articles, and I had a phone call from an email from a journalist the other day who was pitching an idea to the Atlantic Monthly, and he said the editor there shot it down. Even the progressive, thoughtful publications like The Atlantic and The Nation and so many others want to stay within the good graces of the Democratic Party and want to talk about things that they see as being immediately feasible. And they have simply put this idea off to the side and said, someday maybe. And what I and many other people are saying is, someday has to be now, because too many folks are struggling and suffering needlessly, and our planet is being trashed. And one of the key ideas with this is that if we have a basic income, I think it will be relatively easy to get political consensus on higher carbon taxes and on other actions to reduce climate change and global warming.
Which already has substantial left-right support.
Absolutely, it has substantial support. And the climate activists, Bill McKibben's group, 350.org, James Hansen, who's the leading scientist,
Head of Exxon.
Many people are saying, we should have some kind of tax and dividend is the term. And I'm saying, well, let's put the dividend first. Let's talk about the basic income. And then I think people will agree, hey, let's pay for it with a carbon tax, which again is an extension of the idea that goes back to Thomas Paine.
Steve, David, any questions of Stephen?
Yes, I've got a question, Stephen. Like the voices I'm hearing in my head, well, I mean, aside from the one about this particular issue, I just hear people saying, talk about incentives, that if you give people money, what is their incentive to go out and earn a living? That this is, there's a moral component to this, and you just can't hand people money.
Well, and the answer is, in part, why not? It's a basic income. It's a floor. It's enough so that you can manage food and shelter. But a great many people in our society are handed money. They're called rich people. And they have parents and they have trust funds and they get money, and most of them still want to work. And there are a lot of people who've been making millions of dollars who still want to work because work gives life meaning. And we want to belong and we want to contribute and we want to participate. So I'm saying, let's ensure that everyone at least has a basic income for food and shelter. It's like pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, basic income is boots and bootstraps. Basic income gives everyone the means to pull themselves up, to go to school, to get an education, to find meaningful work.
Why do you give the money to rich people? Like, why don't you have a means test above $1 million or something? What's the reasoning behind that?
The basic reason is that I want all of us to recognize that we are citizens. And in some fundamental way, as citizens, we ought to be equal politically.
I see.
And if we had any means test and say, well, we don't want to give it to the billionaires, then there would be continual political fights about where and how to draw the lines.
That's the general argument against means test. David?
Yeah, I interviewed the CEO of Gravity Payments, Dan Price, last week. He sacrificed his $1 million a year salary to guarantee all 120 of his employees at least $70,000 a year.
By when?
I think it's starting now.
No, it was phased in.
Oh, I should have asked him about that. When does it get?
In a few years, it phases in.
Oh, well, he said that it makes good business sense when he said that most CEOs don't understand that when people have money to spend, they spend more money. Your idea makes good business sense, right?
Absolutely. And everyone talks about GDP and economic growth. Well, it's a huge drag on economic activity when people are struggling to pay their bills and people don't know how they're going to take care of their basic needs. This will liberate creativity and entrepreneurship. People will be able to start businesses. This will make huge business sense. And the gravity payments example, of course, goes back to Henry Ford paying his workers enough money so they could buy his cars.
Right.
If we're going to have a functioning, healthy, competitive economy, then we have to ensure that people can participate as citizens and as consumers.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. It's been very enlightening for more than one reason, and namely that any society doesn't aspire, doesn't imagine, will never envision real possibilities. And we're in a real cultural rut in this country. Our expectation levels, they call it cynicism, are at an all-time low in terms of what our elected representatives in government should be delivering, including protecting us from the Wall Street plutocrats. And it's a controlling process. But people think, well, it's just, I'm not going to participate in all this. I'm not going to vote. So lower expectation levels transform into cynicism, and it's giving up. And the rascals take even greater control over people. So it's good that you're talking about this. I hope anybody listening here knows a publisher who's interested in something important for a change. By all means, give your email again.
Shafarman, SSHAFARMAN @gmail.com. And yes, we're looking for help getting these ideas out in whatever way we can, through getting this book published, through articles, interviews. We're launching this nonprofit and looking for help with getting the funding for that and the staff support for that. And I talk very boldly about this is going to take, and it will be, a peaceful democratic revolution, and the sooner the better, because there's so much needless suffering in the world right now.
We're looking for the first demonstration, along with the $15 minimum wage, for a basic income.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you, Ralph.
We've been talking to Stephen Shafarman, who's the program director of Basic Income Action. Go to basicincomeaction.org for more information. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We'll be back after this.
Stand up, step up, step up. You ought to step up. Rise up, rise up. I know you.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
I think you'll step up, step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up, don't let the system hold you down.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, nader.org. If you would like Ralph Nader's weekly column delivered to your inbox, go to nader.org and sign up for Ralph's weekly column. May 15th through the 17th, you can spend the weekend with Ralph Nader, getting it done, how to restore and repair our wounded democracy. This is taking place at the Rowe Camp and Conference Center out in Rowe, Massachusetts. For more information, call 413-339-4954. Ralph, all last year we were talking about GM's faulty ignition switches. About 200 people either died or were seriously injured, and now a U.S. bankruptcy judge has ruled that GM is not liable for these deaths and injuries?
Judge Gerber made an unfortunate decision. He was the judge in the original bankruptcy where they replaced a new GM, as they called it, with a lot of taxpayer money for the old GM, which they left with all the liabilities but no money. So the ruling recently was that GM is not responsible for serious harm or deaths that occurred in vehicles that crashed before the bankruptcy and were alleged to be defective in suits filed in court. So these people filed suits in courts of law in 2006, 2007, 2008. They thought they were going to have their day in court, rubbed out. Immediately, people might think, well, that's unconstitutional. I mean, you got to have your day in court, trial by jury, Seventh Amendment. But corporate bankruptcy laws are tremendously mischievous and biased in favor of the corporate entity. And this case, which was decided a few days ago, is going to be appealed to a 3-court judge panel in the Federal Circuit Court. But not many people expect Judge Gerber to be overturned. The worst aspect of this tragedy for all these families and their loved ones is that until recently, the U.S. government, having bailed out GM, owned over 60% of the stock, and the UAW, the union, owned over 10%. So they were by far the majority owners of General Motors Corporation, full of tax money, and they could have just said, hey guys at the top, this is the policy you're going to recognize. You are going to negotiate with these people or next of kin and pay them adequate compensation for the lethal defects in your car. And the government did nothing. They could have reformed GM into a global example of corporate responsibility on many fronts, and they did nothing. And they sold the stock at a loss and passed a $15 billion loss bill to the American taxpayer. You see what happens, folks? When you don't take an interest in your government, the government takes very little interest in you.
So, Ralph, how did these judges, and you say it most likely will not be overturned, how do they come to the conclusion? What's the legal basis of this?
Well, bankruptcy is supposed to eliminate past debts, right? If a person goes bankrupt, you start with a clean sheet. Well, the principle applies in spades for corporate bankruptcies. So they say, okay, the company's bankrupt, and they're going to eliminate these debts or pay a couple cents on the dollar. The flaw in Judge Gerber's decision is that he based his exoneration of GM for past liabilities in product defect cases on the belief that the heads of GM didn't know about this before the bankruptcy. Because if they knew about it, it would have been fraud that they covered up, and that is an exemption from being exonerated under bankruptcy. Well, there are people in GM who did know about it. They may not have been the CEO, but there were engineers and others in 2005, 2006, 2007 who knew about it, and the lawyers for the plaintiffs or next of kin were already contacting them. So I think it was a factual misstatement by Judge Gerber. And that's going to be the basis for the appeal. When did GM know and who knew it? Before the bankruptcy.
Now, you say in your statement that the old GM faced about $32 billion in claims, but only had $9.25 billion in assets. Would that have completely wiped out the company? Is that what they're worried about?
No, because the claims are never what actually gets transmitted to the plaintiffs. I mean, they can claim $10 million, $20 million, they end up with $1 million in terms of a verdict or a settlement.
Switching topics here very quickly. Last week was tax day. When Republican Ted Cruz announced for President, Ralph, recently he spoke about abolishing the IRS. You posted a column on the Huffington Post recently that took a different tack. You don't think the IRS is powerful enough. Tell us about that.
It isn't a matter of power. It's a matter of whether they have enough staff to collect over $300 billion in evaded taxes every year. That's billion with a B. And they don't. Their budget was about $12.5 billion, the price of an aircraft carrier, 2 years ago. It's now $10.8 billion. They're laying off thousands of auditors and investigators, and every dollar that the IRS spends on collecting taxes on its own staff collects $7 to $8 in revenue. So here are the Republicans hammering the IRS, and they're also worried about deficits. So every billion they slice off the IRS are billions of dollars that aren't collected to reduce the deficit. But nobody accused the Republicans of any kind of modest consistency. They have a very good director, John Koskinen, who has a sterling reputation of saving failed companies and bad situations. And he's strapped, and he says it. He says the reason why you can't get the IRS on the phone for a half hour, or 2 hours is because we don't have enough people accepting these calls. And it's just amazing how nobody's organized this, because I suspect that a lot of people who pay their taxes fully and on time are pretty upset that a lot of other people and corporations aren't paying their taxes. So either we have reduced services, reduced infrastructure repair, or people have to pay more taxes because others are not paying their taxes at all. So I think there should be a demonstration in front of the IRS headquarters with placards that basically said, we taxpayers demand a larger budget, a restored budget at the least, of the Internal Revenue Service so they can collect the taxes from tax evaders. $300 billion a year? That's a lot of money.
You wrote that the Reagan administration, we have the same number of IRS employees as we did under the Reagan administration, but the population has increased dramatically since then.
Not only population, David, but it's a far more complex tax code. For example, look at all the people who are into Obamacare, and they have to figure out on their tax forms whether they have received too much income and don't qualify for this and that. And there's a whole section of the IRS that has started up to advise people and to monitor people. I mean, in Canada, they have full Medicare for all. They don't have to fill out tax returns in order to adjust to how much health insurance they get. Why do we tie ourselves into knots like this? Because we have given up on our country, on our democracy. We don't get engaged enough. It doesn't take more than 1% of the people to turn the country around on any issue that a majority of people agree with the 1% on. That's all it takes. 3 million people.
Ralph, I went onto the Huffington Post and looked in the comment section because I wanted to see what some people were saying about your article. And I picked out a comment which, again, is one of those voices in my head that, not in my head, but I hear other people would say, and it seemed would be typical. And here's the comment. It says, when is the last time you got more money in your pocket when they punished the rich or corporations? Never, in capital letters. It only makes them go out of business or move their companies elsewhere, just like what I would do if I get punished to work hard or to be successful. How would you respond to that?
The tax burden in this country is the lowest it's been since the 1950s, whether it's corporate taxes or individual taxes. They were much higher in the 60s, which was a very prosperous time. Far less unemployment, far better livelihoods. There's no correlation between lower taxes and better livelihoods. There's too much inequality in this country, too many shenanigans. When the taxes on corporate income were much higher than they are today, in the 1960s, the corporations were humming along, making a lot of money. So the other answer to this responder is simply this. Let's get down to basic fairness here. If you pay your fair share of taxes every April 15th, don't you want your neighbor who's escaping paying any taxes illegally to pay taxes? And if you are an active citizen, that added income might repair your bridge or your road or renovate the schools for your kids. Let's not withdraw to the point of madness here.
I think GE is finally going to repatriate some of their money.
Yeah, GE is finally going to pay taxes. General Electric has gone year after year making billions of dollars, US-based dollars, in profit and pay no income tax, and they get a refund. That's how they've rigged the system. So any worker in General Electric in the last 10 years, any one worker, assembly line or otherwise, white collar, paid more in actual dollars to the US Treasury in taxes than the giant General Electric company. And now, David, as you say, they're bringing back some of their massive profits overseas because they want to use them here for some reasons, and so they have to pay a little tax on it.
We invite you to like Ralph Nader's Facebook page, and one of the perks of liking that page is you get to ask a question that gets read on this radio show. For example, Wanda Renee Grantham says she has no question, Mr. Nader, just 2 compliments. I really wish you would enter the race, and thank you for inventing the seatbelt. It saved my life. Without you, I wouldn't be here. Thank you. Did you invent the seatbelt?
No, I didn't invent the seatbelt. The seatbelt was invented many, many decades ago. I think she's referring to making it a public issue and pushing through mandatory seatbelt installations by the auto companies.
Are you itching to enter the race?
Well, if 1 million people send $20 to have me enter the race as a progressive candidate, I'll do it.
There's the challenge, people. 1 million people, $20. think a lot of people would go for that at this point. That was on the Facebook page, and it actually wasn't a question, but thought you would like to hear that. Here's a person whose life was actually saved and says, acknowledging I wouldn't be here without that. So we'll move to a real question now. This is from Ron Ream. He says, I'm not sure what this actually means. What happens when a country's debt goes into the 20 trillions?
What happens when a country's debt goes into the 20 trillions is you ask the question, how proportionate is that to the whole GDP? So if you have a gigantic 500 trillion economy, it means less. So that's one. The second is, who do we owe this debt to? If we owe it to ourselves, it's not that bad. If we owe it to Japanese and Chinese and European investors, they get more influence over our economy, and we may not like that. The other question is, what created the deficit? If the deficit was created heavily by capital investment, rebuilding our public works all over the country, that's not bad. But if it's created by a lot of waste and inefficiency and corporate welfare and weapons we don't need in our Department of Defense arsenal and wars of empire that are making us more insecure and creating more hatred and more fighters against us in more countries, that's bad. So that's roughly the framework of discussing deficit spending and accumulated deficits.
Erwin Alamein asks, Ralph, what do you think of tax credits for charitable donations? Isn't it just a sneaky way of deciding how your taxes get spent? Doesn't it defeat the purpose of charitable giving? Shouldn't the giving itself be its own reward? Same with tax credits for political donations.
Let's take one at a time here. Charitable giving goes back to early religious principles for all the major religions. It's called the tithe. But if a society democratically wants to see more charitable giving, it will enlist the taxpayer as a silent partner and allow someone to give $10,000 for a scholarship to go to college and take a deduction. I don't see anything wrong with that, as long as the goals of the charity are not political. They are real charity, either dealing with hunger and soup kitchens, or they're educational, dealing with civic issues or learning by students. As far as tax credits for political contributions, I think the questioner is talking about a situation as in Oregon, where up to a certain dollar level, you can give a political contribution and cancel it out in terms of your state taxes. So let's say if there's a tax credit of $200 and you owed $500 in Oregon state taxes, you could give a politician or a trust fund that goes to candidates who are on the ballot $200, you pay $200 less in Oregon taxes.
Can Sheldon Adelson deduct Newt Gingrich?
No. For the really huge tax contributions, there's no tax deduction. It's just for the tiny ones, like $200, $300, $100. The checkoff on your tax return is not a tax credit. So if you check off $5 or $10, that doesn't affect your taxes.
Let's move on to another question. Thank you, Erwin. This is from Stephen Shelton. It says, you seem to concern most of your information expressed to the United States, North America. With respect to larger foreign policy, how important is it that America be understood as both unique and respectable, if not admired, in the global community?
Well, I think you're right. On these programs, we haven't paid that much attention to other countries. But if you get my column every week, you'll see I do pay attention to other countries. You just get it free by going to nader.org and signing up. Also, in my recent book that just was published, Return to Sender, there are a lot of letters to Bush and Obama on foreign and military policy. I think it's very important the U.S. be respected, and we're not doing a very good job of that. We're an empire, the only global empire, with bases in over 100 countries, pushing various countries around, sending soldiers and drones and arming dictatorships overseas. So we've got a lot of work to do as citizens in taking greater control over our foreign and military policies.
I think we have time for one last question. Ralph, Justin McCarthy asks, he says, in your book, Unstoppable, you speak of a number of issues on which the far left and right can find common ground, foreign policy, government spending, etc. Yet you also speak more broadly in other works of your dismay with capitalism. The argument in Unstoppable that Democrats and Republicans can work together is by definition very neoliberal. So how do you rectify this contradiction?
Well, I don't think it's very neoliberal. Neoliberal supports NAFTA and the World Trade Organization and the forthcoming Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. Left-right don't like these trade agreements. They think they damage seriously U.S. sovereignty, local, state, national, ability to control our own country, and they ship huge numbers of jobs and industries to fascist and communist regimes overseas who know how to keep their workers in their place and then ship the products back to the U.S. Also, left-right opposes civil liberties restrictions and the Patriot Act. It's against crony capitalism, or what the left calls corporate welfare, bailouts, handouts, giveaways. So while it isn't a frontal displacement of corporate capitalism, it weakens very, very severely the power and the tools that corporate capitalism uses to work against communities, against workers, against consumers, against small taxpayers who have to subsidize these behemoths when they collapse due to their own corruption or mismanagement, as Wall Street collapsed on the economy in 2008, 2009.
Keep those Facebook questions coming. We'll work our way through them. We've come to the end of another Ralph Nader Radio Hour. And on behalf of David Feldman and Ralph Nader, my name is Steve Scrovan. Join us again next week for another exciting episode of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Thank you very much, David and Steve, and thank the listeners. Spread the word. Get more radio stations picking up the program. Together, we can make a difference.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long. Thieves in the temple, too much money changing hands. It's really very simple. Just make a list of demands. We demand freedom. We demand equality. We demand justice. It ain't gonna happen until folks like you and me just stand up. Well, you've been